Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to another bookish breakfast. So today we're talking about the alphabet challenge, so I'm going to try and do things at a reasonably quick pace because I have nearly 26 books to talk about in the nature of the alphabet challenge, and I also have to go to work in about 20 minutes, so that's less than a minute per book. So I mentioned last week a set of bookish challenges that I undertook for 2019, and the last one of those challenges was to complete the alphabet challenge, which is to read a book for every letter of the alphabet, and you can ignore like little words like A and B and just like go with the first main word to try and build up your full alphabet. And at the start of the year, I mentioned that I was quite non-committal with my bookish goals, and basically you could choose to do either the alphabet challenge or what was called the halphabet challenge, where you would commit to only reading only trying to read like half of the alphabet. And I said I was going to go for the halphabet challenge because I thought like I'm going to read probably, I don't count how many books I read in a year, but I thought I'm probably going to read at least 40 books, roughly. So the chances are that within that I'll probably get at least half of the alphabet just by chance. And I did. I think I managed to get over half of the alphabet before halfway through the year. So then I started to think, oh, maybe I could do the complete alphabet. And I think it wasn't until like October or even November that I thought, oh, I could really actually try to do half of the alphabet. So for the last like month or so, I was actually actively trying to complete the alphabet, and then I failed, which kind of like proves the feeling that I had at the beginning of the year of, oh, if I try and do this, I'm not going to succeed, but only really because I didn't commit to it early enough. So today I'm just going to tell you all of the books that I read for all of the different letters of the alphabet that I did achieve, and yeah, that's pretty much what we're going to do. So for the letter A, I read American War by Omar El Akkad. I had that one as a library book, so I don't have it to do the obligatory waving. And that was a book that I read because of an online course that I did via the University of Edinburgh, I believe, that was called How to Read a Novel. And the course looked at things like unreliable narrators and differences in time frames that as a reader I'd never really given that much thought to. I'd just kind of like taken it for granted. So it was really interesting to have those things unpicked slightly. And this was definitely a really good book to do that with. And I think it's a book that I've come to appreciate more as time's gone on. I think at the time I struggled with the premise, which is that a new civil war has broken out in America that fits along the divide lines of the older Civil War, but that is based around broadly ideas related to climate. And I struggle to believe that the particular way that that war was said to have begun would really have existed, although the war in itself was quite believable. Looking back, I would say that it had a really spot-on description of kind of the way in which violence and conflict is perpetuated across generations. It had a scarily accurate depiction of torture methods, and also it had a very interesting, I can't say whether or not it was accurate because I've never been to one, but it had a very believable portrayal of growing up in a refugee camp as a young child. So I thought those were all very interesting elements to the book that were very, very relevant to the modern time. So that is a book that I probably would recommend, even though at the time I didn't enjoy it quite so much as I do now. It's weird how books do that, they kind of mature in your memory. For the letter B, I read Bed 12 by Alison Murdoch, and again this was one that I borrowed, so I don't have it to hold up. I should say if I start running out of time, I'm going to stop talking about the books, I'm just going to list them. So Bed 12 is Alison Murdoch's memoir, I suppose, of being the relative of somebody who is in critical care for a long period of time, and somehow miraculously he stays in the same bed space. Like all of the patients that we have that stay with us for a long time, they always end up moving to like 8 different places over the course of their admission, but somehow her husband stayed in bed 12 the whole time, so it's called Bed 12 because that's where he was. I read this while I was away with my mum in Rwanda, which is a trip that's going to come up later in the alphabet as well, and as somebody who works in critical care, I found it really, really fascinating to have that relative perspective. I also found it really quite irritating at times, and I think that is to do with Alison's particular personality, which is possibly quite a strong personality. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but her personality did come across at some points in the book in ways that I felt like would have been difficult for me if I had been one of the healthcare professionals involved in caring for her husband. It's very, very difficult because obviously as somebody's wife, you're like the most important person to them, but there is this kind of dynamic where you have a childless couple where for the wife, sometimes the husband is really, really everything, and like not just like their lover, but also in a way their child as well, and there is just a huge amount of emotional intensity directed towards that ill person. And I think all of the things that she tried to do in terms of getting really involved in his care are definitely a good thing, and they're things that I sometimes would encourage people to do if they have a relative in intensive care. And it's definitely a book that I would recommend for my colleagues to read in terms of understanding what it's like to be that wife when your like beloved husband is so ill. But yeah, at times I found it almost like stressful to read what it was like for her. It was definitely interesting. It was also interesting to see her talking about recovery and how her husband's and her experiences of the time when he was getting better were so different because it was actually kind of almost worse for her. So for the letter C, finally we get to one that I can wave. I read The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling. I talked about this relatively recently, so I won't go into too much detail, but it's basically about sort of class divisions and to a lesser extent racial divisions in a very small English village, and quite like a traditional conservative English village. So yeah, that was quite a good book, but maybe a little bit too preachy. The letter D was a letter that I failed on, so I was hoping to finish Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, and that was already going to be a bit of a cheat because obviously it's called Harry Potter, but I was just going to be like, Deathly Hallows? That counts. But unfortunately we didn't finish it. We've still got a decent chunk of the book to go. So yeah, we didn't manage to read aloud the whole of the Harry Potter books in 1 year, which is a little bit disappointing. Mainly because of the Order of the Phoenix, and the more I think about the Order of the Phoenix, the more I kind of hate that book. But anyway, that aside, the other one that I nearly read that was nearly the letter D was Death Comes to Pemberley, which is a murder mystery set at Pemberley with Elizabeth and Darcy and all of that. But I read the first chapter at the very end of Jane Austen July. Really didn't enjoy it, and because it was the end of Jane Austen July, I was like, well, I'll save it and maybe I'll read it next year. So yeah, so I didn't get the letter D. Then for the letter E, sorry, I've got my spreadsheet here. I read Ebola Behind the Mask by Andy Dennis and Anna Simon. Again, this was one that I talked about relatively recently, but it is a non-fiction account of a nurse and a doctor from Europe going to, now I'm going to get the country wrong. Sugar. It wasn't Sierra Leone. It might have been Liberia. Going to one of the countries affected by the Ebola outbreak, basically, and working in one of the Ebola treatment units, and kind of like the challenges that they faced and the way that care had to be given. Again, it was one of those books that the writing is possibly not the best thing ever, but the story that they're telling is so unique that it is worth pushing through some of the slightly clunky writing just to find out about that completely unique experience in terms of dealing with that outbreak from that perspective of an outsider to the community. Then for the letter F, I reread The Fellowship of the Ring. I think this is the first one that was an audiobook from the list. And obviously, again, it's The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, but I kind of I talked it through with my consultants on the topic, and we agreed that the series title, we could just ignore that and focus on the actual title, so The Fellowship of the Ring. And yeah, I found it a little bit slower going at first. I found that I really had to get back into Tolkien's way of writing, but once I had got into that style, I really enjoyed it again, and I enjoyed the whole series. So yeah, so that was the letter F. For the letter G, again, I kind of cheated slightly and cut off the bit that's the Saga of, but I read Gunnlaug Wormtongue, and that was for Saga Long last year, and that was, yeah, it was really good. I really enjoyed it, and I was quite surprised because I hadn't really read a saga before. I was quite surprised by that, like the depth and the intricacy of the story. It's really got a kind of like a narrative, whereas I kind of expected it almost not to have, as being quite an old myth. So I'm excited to read more sagas coming soon. And then the next thing that I read was The House of Bernarda Alba. I didn't write the author, but I'm 98% sure it's Lorca. So this was a play. It's the first play on the list, and I read this while I was in Rhondda with my mum, and Rhondda is Roz from Scally Dandling About the Books. Check out her new channel if you haven't done so already. Rhondda is in Andalusia, which was Lorca's kind of like home turf. So while we were there, we wanted to read a couple of things that would fit with the surroundings. I really thought that I had a physical copy of this. I know I read it on my Kindle, but I thought I had a physical copy, but I apparently don't. And it is basically about a household full of women. I think it starts with the funeral of the father of the family, or it starts with the funeral of like a significant man, and it just leaves these kind of four women very kind of claustrophobically together, the mother and her three daughters, and like it kind of examines the kind of conflicts between them and their kind of romantic entanglements in quite a conservative society, and like aspects in terms of extramarital sex and things like that in a little bit of a risky way, considering this was like 1920s Spain, which was a very, very Catholic country. Yeah, and it's really great and it's really atmospheric, and I really enjoyed reading it while I was in Spain. So that was a good one for me. Then I have two letters that I failed. I didn't read anything for letter I. I was really sure that I read something that began like I something something, but I can't think of anything that I did read that would fit that. And then J, and I was hoping to read either Julius Caesar or Journey's End for one of the other challenges for the GCSE English Lit challenge, but then I didn't. So I kind of like left J because I thought I was going to cover it, and I didn't. I think I'm going to sneeze. Oh, maybe not. Then for the letter K, again, this is an example of me cheating ever so slightly, because I talked about the Lord of the Rings and ignoring the kind of Lord of the Rings part of the title. But for the letter K, I read Kristin Lavaransdattar brackets the Garland or the Bridal Wreath, which is the first book in the trilogy of Kristin Lavaransdattar books by Sigrid Undset. Again, I didn't write down the author, but I think it's Sigrid Undset. So yeah, so I just kind of went with the K there. And I read that while I was on holiday in Norway with Bo, because I was trying to read books from the country while I'm away somewhere. Yeah, and I enjoyed that, and I've already mentioned that I read the old translation. I just enjoyed like seeing her journey from being a very small child to being a mature woman. I definitely did not agree with all of her choices. I was very frustrated with the main character at times, and also quite like scared for her, because it makes it clear that it's quite a risky environment to be in. But I really enjoyed reading it while we were going to. They have like loads of like cultural museums where you can go and see the old farmhouses. So it was very nice to read that and then be able to like go and physically visit an old-fashioned style wooden farmhouse that would be similar to what Kristin Lavaransdattar could have lived in. So that was, yeah, very interesting, and it fit very well. How am I doing? Kind of all right. Then, oh, all falling over. For the letter L, I read Light in August by William Faulkner, and this was for Faulkner in August, which was a read-along that was, gosh, it's been a while. It was definitely Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics and Brian at Bookish. I'm just kind of asking myself whether it was also Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse was also a host for this, but somehow I think not. I'm getting confused. It was all the way back in August. I'm really sorry if you read this and I didn't mention you, but I know my mum read it as well, and we kind of had shared discussions on it. I had mixed feelings on this. I really enjoyed the first half. As it got deeper and deeper in, I found it harder and harder to accept some of the characterization. some of it was like really spellbinding and gripping and very, very tense, and some of it I just couldn't quite have that much faith in or got slightly confused by. So that was Light in August by William Faulkner. Then for the letter M, I read Miss Marple's Final Cases. You can tell that I got this from my lovely local British Art Foundation shop because they insist on putting at least 3 stickers on every single book that they sell. And I'm pretty sure this is a collection of short stories about like cases that Miss Marple solves when she's in like the later days of her life. And I really enjoyed this. I always enjoy a good Miss Marple. So yeah, there's not much more to say about that. It was fun. Then for the letter N, I read The New Odyssey by Patrick Kingsley. I feel a little bit guilty about being able to wave this around because it is indeed a library book, and I probably have a fine by now because I think I got it out about October. But it hasn't been requested, because if it gets requested they send you an email, unless I missed the email. But anyway, so this is a Guardian correspondent who was their like migration correspondent, writing about going to various sites that are important on migrant trails towards Europe in the year of the great increase in numbers of migrations to Europe, or the increase in attention paid to the numbers of people migrating to Europe, which was 2015-2016, and just kind of like talking through various aspects of that, and also focusing on a specific journey of one specific man who he met on several occasions, making his way from Syria via Egypt up as far as Sweden, and like talking about the different reasons why people want to go to different countries. And I think that was one of the really interesting things about this book, is particularly in the UK we have this perception that everybody wants to come to Britain, which is just categorically not the case, and people have very specific reasons why they choose to go to a specific country based on their perceptions of family reunification, the ability to get a job, the ability to understand the language, and how welcoming that society is to people from their nationality. So it was quite good to have that kind of laid out in a book and kind of examined a little bit. So yes, that was The New Odyssey. Then for the letter O, this was another one that I read as an audiobook. It was Our Mutual Friend by Dickens, and I read this for Victober. One of the things I like about this is you can really see the extent to which BookTube has influenced my reading, in terms of like the things that I've read at various points because of BookTube events. I kind of didn't think when I started BookTube that it would influence what I read as much as it does. Anyway, so Our Mutual Friend, I read this as an audiobook. It's a tie-off between this one and The Handmaid's Tale for like best reread of the year, I think. I also reread Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but to me that was less of a good reread. Like, I knew that I would love it, so it didn't really change that much in my opinion because I already love it. Our Mutual Friend and The Handmaid's Tale both probably improved for me. This one, it just like strengthened for me how much I love Dickens's writing and his sense of humour. It really, really works for me. One of the biggest disappointments is that Beau is currently listening to this audiobook now, and he is really not enjoying it. Like, he says he likes the characters, he likes the plot, but he doesn't like the writing style, and that for me is the thing that really makes Dickens. So yeah, that's a bit of a shame, but not everyone can like everything. So yes, that was Our Mutual Friend, thanks to Victober. Then for the letter P, I read Poirot Investigates, another Miss Marple, which for some reason, it's another one that came from a charity shop. It's categorised as furniture, you see. Like, whoever's put the label on has labelled it as furniture, which is amusing to me. And I think it's another collection of short stories, and again, it was just simple and fun. Then, for the letter Q was another one that I failed. I can't even remember if there was one that I was planning to read for it, but I didn't read it, so I didn't manage the letter Q. Like, the letter D I was quite surprised not to get. The letter I was quite surprised not to get. The letter Q is a pretty obvious one. If you don't try to get the letter Q, you're probably not going to. Although there are quite a few options. Other people read Quartet in Autumn by Barbara Pym, Quantum by Patricia Cornwall, Queen of the Mersey by Maury Lee, Qualified by Vera Nazarian. So there were quite a few options, but I just didn't read any of them. Then for the letter R, I read The Return of the Soldier by Rebecca West. This was a book that I read right at the start of last year. I did a short review of it, and like it was quite fun because then a couple of other people read it. I know Joseph from Joseph Francis Burton read it, and he made like a response video also talking about it. And it focuses on a story of a soldier who comes back from the war with severe amnesia, whereby he completely forgets about his current marriage, and he only remembers about a relationship that he had many years before that the war broke out. It's interesting because it's seen as being like a kind of like a shell shock or a PTSD. Having recently done more kind of learning about PTSD and like processing of traumatic events as part of a course that I'm doing, it's really nothing like what PTSD is like. It's more like what happens with a head injury, but again, having worked with people with head injuries, it's really not something that happens with head injuries either. But it is a very, very interesting like premise for a story, and one that I very much enjoyed, and it was kind of interesting to see him kind of finding out about the world again and the impact that it had, particularly on his wife and another female relative who wasn't his sister, some kind of woman who I'm pretty sure was also in love with him. So it was interesting, like the kind of romantic story there. Then the letter S, I read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and this was a really big book a good few years ago, and as usual I was a long way behind because I think this is one that I inherited from my parents. They were getting rid of it and I was like, oh, finally I get to read this. And it tells the story of Achilles from the perspective of his friend whose name I have forgotten, Patroclus. And it's really interesting. It looks at their relationship, their romantic relationship, and the other things that Achilles has to prioritise and decide between in terms of his role as a Greek hero. I'm not going to go into that any further because I know that it is a well-known and much beloved book. It was a good read. Probably not like a top read, but it was enjoyable. For the letter T, I read Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. As I've already said, like I know that I love this book and I did indeed enjoy it again on the reread, but there's not much point going into it in too much depth. I did listen to it as an audiobook and yeah, I enjoyed it. Then for the letter U, surprisingly I managed to do this one. It was Unequal Affections by Lara Ormiston, and I read that as part of Jane Austen July. Struggling to think then. And Unequal Affections is a retelling of the ending of Pride and Prejudice, in which Elizabeth accepts Darcy on his first proposal. I kind of struggled to believe this book because I thought going into it there were two things that would have to happen for Elizabeth to ever accept that first proposal. Number one is she would have to not know about Darcy's role in separating Jane and Bingley. Spoilers for Pride and Prejudice. And number two, his proposal would have to be different and cause her less of like a personal insult. And neither of those two things happened, and I just don't believe that Elizabeth would ever accept Darcy without those things being changed. I also felt like it was a little bit too much on like the kissy side of things. One of the brilliant things about Jane Austen is the way that she is able to convey affection so strongly without resorting to any scenes of physical affection. Because obviously of the kind of accepted standards of the time, but I felt like it was a little bit too like racy as opposed to being true to the original text. But that was just me personally. I did enjoy it and I read it quite quickly, so that was Unequal Affections. Then for the letter V, I had another failure. I tried to read Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Jachenko. I'm just not even going to try. This is a very interesting book and definitely one that I would recommend. But when I first picked it up on this channel, I described it by comparing it to Harry Potter and the Hunger Games. I'm now at the end of part 2, so I just ran out of memory, which is really annoying, like just so near the end of the alphabet as well. So I'm probably going to end up putting this up a day late so that I have time to like splice the two parts together. It was kind of a relief to get to the end of part 2. Now I would describe it as like Harry Potter without Voldemort, or like the Hunger Games, but the kids don't have to kill each other. like there is a definite lack of threat in the book, which really affects the pacing. I think that's one of the things that makes it so interesting, because it's a book really, it's quite like cerebral in terms of for YA fantasy. It's really quite a thoughtful book, and it's a book just really focused on learning and what you can achieve with learning, and like where that can take you and what it can do. In a fantasy novel, obviously that takes you somewhere quite different from in learning in the real world. But yeah, I kind of, it's not actually dragging me through it at quite the pace that I was hoping to get through it, and I definitely didn't finish it before the start of 2020. Surprisingly, the next letter, oh, I know my alphabet, I was thinking the next letter was X, but it is in fact W. So the next letter, as I've just said, is W, White Tears. I read by Harry Kunzru, and this was another one that I read for that How to Read a Novel course at the start of the year. And I really, really enjoyed it. And this looks at kind of like race and privilege in America, and kind of, I was going to say righting ancestral wrongs, but like the way in which conflicts could potentially play out in a slightly surreal world. Yeah, it's really interesting, but really hard to explain. But it's basically about two music lovers who are collecting old recordings, and they find this recording that they make this recording. They think they've invented a song, basically, and then people start coming to them and saying that this song is real. And that leads to a pattern of escalating violence and tension throughout the book, and links back to events in history that were also quite dark. Very difficult to explain, very interesting, and very highly recommended, I would say, about White Tears. Then the next letter is X, which surprisingly I managed to read. So I went through various collections and so on looking for the letters I had missing, and I found a poem called Xantippe by Amy Levy, and that was a poet that I had already read a poem by in Victober and felt like she was somebody that I wanted to read more of. So I was like, this is perfect, I get to read somebody I wanted to read more of, and it works for one of my letters. So I read Xantippe by Amy Levy, and that is the story of, I have completely forgotten where the character of Xantippe comes from, but basically she is the wife of a philosopher, and it's about her frustration in not being seen as like a thinking entity, I suppose. Yeah, it was a good poem. Yeah, it was quite interesting. You can tell it wasn't like the best poem ever, but it was good. And then for the letter Y, it's taken a little bit longer than I was hoping it to, so I think I'm going to have to get a slightly later bus. I read Yerma by Lorca, and this is my very old parallel text version that has got the English on this side and the Spanish on the other. But I think I read it on the Kindle, and again I read it while I was in Rwanda because I was trying to read things from that area. And it is the story of a woman who is unable to conceive a child, or her husband is unable to conceive a child, I suppose, from his side. But basically the really like harrowing upset that she experiences by not being able to fulfill her her wish of becoming a mother. So yeah, so that was really, yeah, it was a good read. It was a reread. I've definitely read this one before. And I still, like, one day I want to read it in Spanish, but I don't know whether, I feel like my Spanish is going downhill as opposed to uphill at the moment, so I don't know whether I will actually ever achieve that. Then finally, I did not achieve the letter Z, sadly, so yeah, that's a shame. I could have read Zorba the Greek, that comes highly recommended by Roz. My dad read Zuleika Dobson, not a book that I've heard of, by Max Beerbohm, and somebody else read Zorro by Isabel Allende, and that is a book that I have read previously and I did really enjoy, so I could have reread that one, but I didn't, so I missed out the letter Z. So I can't even remember how many letters that I missed, but it was D, I, J, Q, V, and Z. So I missed out 6 letters of the alphabet. I'm tempted to retry the alphabet challenge for 2020 because I do think that it would be possible for me to achieve it. but I don't know, I might give it a break for a couple of years. And yeah, so next year, the challenge that fills a similar spot on our challenge list is what is going to be called the Decades Challenge. And weirdly, that challenge was invented separately by myself and my mum pretty much on the same day. And basically the premise is, it is now 2020, which is like a decade end / beginning. So the challenge is to read one book for every decade for the last century. So a book from the 1920s, a book from the 1930s, a book from the 1940s, and so on and so forth, right up to a book from the 20-teens, which I'm really looking forward to trying. And there is also one called the Rainbow Challenge, where you have to read a book, 7 books I guess it would be, to create a rainbow colour at the end, which will be kind of interesting and a little bit of a different challenge in terms of it doesn't matter what the content is, it's really just about picking ones with really brightly coloured covers, so that could be fun. But again, I'm not committing too hard as yet. So thank you very much for watching. I'm sorry this has been a longer video, I had better dash. I hope you have a lovely day and a lovely week, and I'll speak to you soon.